Welcome to this discussion sponsored by the Center for African American Studies Graduate Affairs Program. My name is Josh Guide. I'm an Associate Professor of History and African American Studies and the Director of Graduate Affairs in CAS. We are excited to be convening what I think is a timely conversation with a distinguished panel whom I'll introduce in a moment. We want to thank the Center and particularly our chair, Professor Eddie Glaude, for his support for this event. And we are profoundly grateful to the staff of CAS, particularly Dion Worthy, Allison Bland, and Elio Leo, without whom literally this would not be possible. In addition, I want to note, in addition to those of you who are here with us live in person, we are joined by many people watching via live stream and following us on Twitter. So you can direct your questions and your comments for our panelists by using the hashtag blkstudiesdigitalage on Twitter. And we'll try to get as many of those questions folded into the conversation as possible during the time that we have. Now, there are a number of kind of overarching themes or overarching concerns that I think bring us together today. This is an age, you don't need me to tell you, this is an age of media saturation and digital technological proliferation, right? To my mind, it's marked by paradoxes of particular kinds of hypervisibility, right? Set against new forms of erasure, new modes of communicative access, side by side with new mechanisms of surveillance, of enclosure, and of denial. How do racial discourses and anti-Black discourses in particular function in this environment? Or maybe more pressingly, how should we approach the work of anti-racist critique, anti-racist pedagogy, anti-racist organizing in a digital age? What does it mean to do serious intellectual and political work in this media-saturated time? And for those of us in the academy, how does one think carefully about the complexities of race and all of its intended and intersecting issues on digital platforms that have a reach that extends well beyond our classrooms and, frankly, well beyond most scholarly and academic publishing venues? What are the possibilities, but also what are the limits of doing this kind of work on Twitter, on Facebook, on Tumblr, on Instagram, YouTube, on podcasts, blogs, and so forth? Thinking of hypervisibility, right? We have these videos that depict the murders of Eric Garner, of Tamir Rice, of Walter Scott, just to take three recent examples. We have the photographs of the Garissa massacre victims in Kenya. How do we understand the pervasiveness of these images of Black death that circulate in our current moment, circulate virally? What are the ethics of viewing these images? And for us as teachers, how might we distinguish between bearing witness and exploitation? And how do we think about digital media as providing spaces as well as for alternatives, right? Or at least complementary representations alongside those views of Black death? So those are just some kinds of questions that I hope we can at least try to touch on in our conversation. I expect this conversation will extend well beyond the time that we have together and continue online and in other venues well past today. In terms of format, each of our panelists will get us started with some brief opening remarks. And then from there, I'll moderate a conversation between them, give them a chance to expand upon their initial comments, respond to one another as wished, but also to raise additional questions for our consideration. And after that, we'll open up for conversation and questions from our audience, both local and virtual. So now let me introduce our panelists. Professor M. Neelika Jayawardane. Ooh, terrible. Say it for me. Jayawardane, thank you. Is an associate professor of English at the State University of New York, York-Oswego. And she's also a senior editor and contributor to the online magazine Africa is a Country. In addition, she's an honorary research associate at the Center for Indian Studies in Africa at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. Professor Jayawardane was born in Sri Lanka, but grew up in the Copper Belt province in Zambia. Her academic publications focus on the nexus between South African literature, photography, and transnational, transhistorical implications of colonialism and apartheid on the body. She publishes regularly on photography and art, and is also working on a fictional memoir entitled The Escape Artist. Renina Jarmon is a writer and a blogger currently pursuing her PhD in the Department of Women's Studies at the University of Maryland. A Bay Area native, Renina received her BA from Eugene Lang College of the New School University in 2000, and now calls Washington, D.C. home, I believe. Her interests in feminism, race, popular culture, technology, and Black women's sexuality are evidenced in her long-running blog, New Model Minority, And in her book, Black Girls Are From the Future, Essays on Race, Digital Creativity, and Pop Culture, published in 2013. And finally, last but certainly not least, our own Professor Ruha Benjamin. Professor Benjamin is Assistant Professor in the Center for African American Studies, specializing in the interdisciplinary study of science, medicine, and biotechnology, race, ethnicity, and gender, health and biopolitics, and the sociology of knowledge. She's also a faculty affiliate in the program in the History of Science, the Center for Health and Well-Being, the Gender and Sexuality Studies program, the Department of Sociology, the program on Global Health and Health Policy. Her courses include the popular Race is Socially Constructed, Now What? And Black to the Future, Science, Fiction, and Society. She's the author of People, Science, Bodies, and Rights on the Stem Cell Frontier, published by Stanford University Press, which examines the tension between innovation and equity in the context of state investment in the stem cell research and against the backdrop of medical experimentation on subordinate social groups. Her next project takes up some of these questions on biopolitics and ethics in the uptake of genomics in South Africa, India, and in the United States. So thank you to all three of you, and we'll get started with Renina.
Thank you for having me here today, and thank you for showing up at a time of the semester when we are all so terribly busy. Mm-hmm. I would like to open by thanking Professor Guild for inviting me and to Ms. Dion Worthy for assisting me with my travel arrangements. As a Black feminist, it is important that I acknowledge the labor, especially the behind-the-scenes work. Lastly, I'd like to thank the Center for African American Studies and Princeton for hosting me. We're here today to discuss digital technologies, digital Black studies, and the contemporary contours of Black life. So I'm going to start with a story. I like stories and storytelling. During the summer of 2013, a movie was released titled Fruitvale Station. It was about the death of Oscar Grant. I love movies and I love my hometown. However, I don't find the image of an African-American man being killed to be entertaining. In fact, I avoided it. I bought a ticket because it was beautiful, but I didn't attend it. I've tried to avoid many of these images of Black death that are constantly circulating. Why? I think the more that I watch these images, the more I am inclined to internalize these images of Black death. And politically, I'm invested in Black life. There are consequences to the circulation and consumption of these images. I take them very seriously. Within the last 3 years, there has been a visual turn on the internet, so it isn't surprising to me, right, that there's these images circulating at this moment. Right now, we are sitting at a contemporary moment that allows for the global circulation of these images. Sociologist Matthew Berkhold once said to me, people buy what makes them feel comfortable. I am going to extend that theory and ask, what is so comforting about these images of Black death? In fact, interrogating the global consumption of Black death has always been important to me. For a long time, I wrote about hip hop and feminism. And one of the things I was always interested in was, why are we not doing more interrogation around the circulation of these hyper sort of toxic representations of Black masculinity and how they move in the world? Specifically in terms of ecosystems of images, I see Black Lives Matter, the hashtag and the movement work, as being in direct conversation with and in opposition to Black death. Black Lives Matter was created by 3 women of color, Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi. What I find striking about this is that it is a public and collective self-documentation of Black life and Black people's lived experiences. In a climate where Black lives are taken publicly and with impunity, Black people's self-documentation is a political act. To that end, the digital work that is happening online constitutes a collective off and online self-documentation within the public sphere. I think that it is incredibly important. I find it fascinating that Black women's visibility and knowledge production are central to these social justice movements. For the future, I'm interested in the ways in which this work will be archived. The internet is an ephemeral, unstable and dynamic space. What is here today may not be here tomorrow. I'm interested in the tension between the need to be visible and do this work, but I also understand the need for anonymity and privacy, right? It's risky to do this work in the public, right? With regard to graduate and undergraduate students thinking about the digital as a space to engage with broader publics, I'm interested in questions of power, ethics, and accountability. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
I echo her thanks, and I won't repeat what you said, but I very much appreciate, Dion, your work. I know there was so many delays, so I so much appreciate your presence, not just in bodily form. And thank you so much for inviting me as well. I want to start by introducing the blog on which I work, and Megan Eardley here too contributes regularly. In 2011, The Economist came out with a cover titled Africa Rising, together with an illustration of a boy flying a rainbow-colored kite, the shape of the continent. 11 years earlier, however, the same publication called Africa, the Hopeless Continent, on one of its covers. Africa Rising soon became a phrase repeated by a small percentage of people who had commercial interests in projecting that Africa Rising story, as well as by certain elite cultural producers who also wanted to be associated with a better view of Africa. It became the go-to phrase to use when endorsing one's favorite NGO. But that hawkish interest and relentless positivism in the continent soon went bust. Between 2014 and 2015, news narratives about Ebola, Boko Haram, and Bring Back Our Girls hashtag took over pretty much toppled the Africa Rising trope. And CNN went right back to putting Nigeria on top of Nigeria and calling Ebola the ISIS of biological agents. And then also more recently, taking away Tanzania's entire coastline, it became Uganda. I don't know what happened to the Swahili coast. In the last few weeks, Africa, in quotes, has been reconfigured through familiar tropes of violence and savagery. First, there were the Al-Shabaab attacks on Garissa University in northern Kenya that left 148 students and other personnel dead, with little of the worldwide attention or support or condemnation that was in evidence when the officers of the French satirical newspaper Charlie Hebdo reporters were killed by extremists. Although Kenyans took to the streets to support the families of those who were killed, there was little of the dramatic global solidarity seen after Charlie Hebdo. Then presidents of former French colonies from Africa showed up to display solidarity with French ideals of liberté and égalité. There were dictators on show everywhere. Nobody questioned that they were dictators. It was just a great photo opportunity for them. However, there was no such rally on the streets of Kenya with African leaders coming to show their support. This recent spate of xenophobic violence in South Africa, focused mainly in Durban and Johannesburg, finally got the sleepy New York Times to write a brief 9-paragraph article on the 17th of April, which is, I think, Friday. The violence had by then been going on for a week. It was a pathetic summary of everything that had already been reported. So I want to switch gears and ask, why are these images and news narratives so powerful, both in terms of what's repetitively told about African locations and African people, as well as what's absent in these narratives? I want to propose that in recent history, as in medieval times, the visual arts accompanied by instructive narratives are given the responsibility of teaching us how to recognize bad people from good, treacherous from trustworthy. These new news narratives and accompanying images shape and inform current views of Africa, Africans, and race. And they recirculate images of Conradian heart of darkness tropes. And together they present a familiar Africa that has never emerged from that darkness. we see just how effective these narratives are in the viral popularity of hashtag Kony 2012. That is the campaign to, in quotes, make the Ugandan warlord Joseph Kony famous. In the recent and short history of Africa's place in online global politics, this 29-minute so-called film around which pivoted the campaign and the organization behind it, Invisible Children, it remains a dominant template for how the global public sphere, specifically its online variant, still engages with African issues and Africans. It was obvious to most people who think right and engage critically with regional African issues that this so-called film had little to say about Ugandan history or politics, and in fact completely ignored the fact that Kony was largely subdued and an irrelevant figure by 2012. So hashtag Kony 2012 was and is above all about Americans and not Uganda. If we look at it as a mass media phenomenon, it provides more insight into American mass media culture than anything about the politics of East African warfare or child welfare in East Africa, because all the stuff was about child soldiers, right? Together, these images and narratives shape Africans as helpless, damaged, diseased, virulently violent, racialized subjects, perhaps more importantly even, visually arresting and newsworthy narratives with their attendant hashtag viral activism like Kony 2012, bad maps depicting the spread of Ebola, and even the absence of good reportage about Garissa University and the xenophobic violence in South Africa, disseminate a vision of black savagery and incompetency that's not resolved until the benign hand of Bono, Clooney, and recently Ben Affleck, the man who tried to suppress the fact that he had an ancestor who was a slave owner, until they enter and magically attempt to resolve things. Yet, when their efforts inevitably fail, we're left with a reinforced view of the problem of Africa. And that usually paves the way for US intervention, of which there were 674 US military interventions in Africa in 2014 alone, of which we know nothing. But whilst the social and popular media narratives often replicate and reinforce those dominant racist, sexist, capitalist power structures with which we are familiar, there are ways, I hope, with which we can intervene. And essentially the project that we're doing at Africa as a Country is one of intervention. And at its inception, Africa as a Country was a blog run by just one person, media scholar Sean Jacobs, who's now at the New School for Public Engagement. He then invited a small group of contributors who were his regular readers, like me, and I'd use his blog in class all the time. And it was funny because, my American students are not used to irony directed at them, so they read it like straight-faced, like we're saying things, and they would say, oh yes, it's so good that America's going, and I'd say, no, please, there's irony in there, we're laughing at that, and it's actually not effective. So you have to kind of also teach to read ironically.
Africa's not a country.
Africa's not a country. So that was like really, that we get like lots of hate mail from people saying, don't you know it's a continent with 54 countries? And then this is a real response, right? So from there, our main aim has been to destabilize existing narratives about the continent and its peoples. Second, we also wanted to capture how Africans and the greater diaspora think about their shared geographic and conceptual space of origin, not just the geography of it, but those concepts that we have in relation to one another, as well as in relationship to migration, globalization, and fluctuating identity politics. Our mission is to create a location which is contrarian, where those contrarian difficult truths can be discussed, no matter how many people care at that moment about that issue. Part of what blogging allows us to do is exchange, debate, and open up categories that previously seemed closed off, those colonial, ethnographic, anthropological visions that contributed to how Africa is seen and spoken about today. For instance, the Cambridge the official title of it, there's a new book on Mandela out. There's, I think, one black scholar being invited to contribute towards that. And I like the pieces in there, but I also think about how knowledge is being produced about Mandela's legacy. It's very difficult to enter those spaces, especially in a place like South Africa. I think, in the last few weeks, in fact, it's not, you can see that it's not been our mission to deny things or act as Africa boosters. When mainstream media lost it, when the attacks on Garissa happened, we told people to turn off their television sets and read a compiled list of articles that were actually thoughtful, and below that were all the articles that we knew would actually provide more insightful views. And when Nigeria's then President Goodluck Jonathan purportedly had some minor victories against Boko Haram using so-called South African advisors, in quotes, Megan Eardley here analyzed the short but significant history of using former apartheid regime's security forces in various regional conflicts. And this was one of them who was killed. And our post also analyzed the recent violence against purported foreigners in South Africa without pretense about the Rainbow Nation or Ubuntu. And I think most recently, as you've been saying, you know, there's a blow-by-blow set of photographs about a Mozambican national, Emmanuel Sithole, who was caught on camera being killed by a Sunday Times reporter, James Otway. And there's been a lot of discussion about should he have intervened, what was his role then, and if he had, he would have been part of the news story, but what's wrong with that? And yet there's this kind of enormous voyeuristic interest in those set of pictures by the Times Live in the blog and everything. And so I want to kind of just leave it there and leave more time for discussion, because I just want to kind of present what we're trying to do as a collective. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, so thank you so much to the Center for African American Studies, Graduate Affairs, and especially my colleague, Professor Josh Gild, for organizing this conversation. It's a real honor, actually, to think alongside my two co-panelists. So as someone who doesn't work directly on digital media, what I thought I'd do in my brief comments titled Playing the Game or Hacking the System is to reflect on questions of race, technology, and sociality more broadly as a way for us to start thinking together about the continuities and discontinuities that exist between things we dub digital and other arenas where race is also made and remade. So as a starting point, I want to ask, what if, alongside new media scholar Beth Coleman, we consider race itself as a social technology, one that I suggest produces parallel universes in which people experience radically distinct and unequal versions of the world. So sitting in the same room together, listening to the same panel, for example, but hearing and experiencing different versions of the conversation, shaped by our prior histories and experiences before we entered the room. So when we conceptualize race itself as a technology, one that makes particular social worlds possible and forecloses others, then one of the questions I'd like to wrestle with is how we go about enacting agency within and resistance to techniques of racialization. Is there a way, in other words, to hack racial binaries and debug persistent viruses that make us sick of the world we inhabit? In the social sciences, there's this concept I'm sure you're very familiar with called code switching. It's gone mainstream recently with an NPR blog on race and ethnicity, which they call code switch. So this is a term used to describe something many of us do to some degree as we navigate different social spaces by changing the way we interact with folks in order to fit in, shape-shifting, we might call it. So code switching is one of many ways in which we, quote, play the game of life, garnering respect and advancing in predominantly white work and school settings, all the while maintaining connections to community, friends, and family. But by presenting code switching as just how it is, the concept tends to hide something rather crucial, that cultural codes reflect particular values, interests, and forms of social organization that allow some people to impose their world onto others. To be successful, we're told, we must master the dominant codes, leaning in, learning to successfully play a game, the rules of which are not of our making. So let me pause a moment on this idea and break down what I mean by these competing metaphors, the ideal types of gaming versus hacking. These, as you know, are two widespread ways in which people engage with technology in a literal sense, and I want to use them figuratively to illustrate two ways we can imagine agency and resistance more broadly, keeping in mind I'm using them as ideal types, and that in practice the features may very well overlap. The first mode of engagement, gaming, is typically characterized by recreation, competition, and consumption. That is, we use and play with, but don't usually create the technological platforms and social systems that we set out to game. The second mode, hacking, is typically characterized by mastery, collaboration, and creativity. That is, to hack a system, one needs in-depth understanding of how it works, what its strengths and weaknesses are, and a vision for how it could be better. These insights allow us to subvert the system that we've come to understand and make it do something it wasn't meant to do. This, to me, makes it a potent metaphor for intervening in social systems that were not created with the majority of us in mind. So when we begin to rewrite code rather than simply code switch, we can set out to embed new values and new social relations into the world, much as my co-panelist work does with Africa is a Country and Black Girls Are from the Future. And here I'll give you another quick example of why it matters so much that we do more than play the game, by referring to the literal context of video games. So when we look at the world of video games itself and examine the connection between violence, gender, and race, researchers have found that the majority of African American female characters, a full 86%, were either props, bystanders, or participants, but never competitors. Nearly 9 out of 10 African American females are victims of violence in these games, making them far more likely than any other group to be victimized. And more than half of the African American characters are, quote, unaffected by the violence exacted upon them, with only a fraction exhibiting both pain and physical harm. So in fleshy worlds, as in virtual worlds, the lives of Black women continue to be valued less and our deaths considered less tragic. Tanisha Anderson, Rekia Boyd, Yvette Smith, Natasha McKenna, Ayanna Stanley Jones. What's more, when we begin to think seriously about premature death, we have to account for other kinds of codes beyond the strictly digitized. So while genetic codes occupy much of the scientific establishment's interest in health disparities, we also lose sight in the process of the way racial realities map onto zip codes. Consider that nearly 70% of Black people in the US live within 30 miles of coal-powered plants that spew extremely poisonous toxins into the air every day, contributing to cancer, chronic heart conditions, and respiratory diseases ranging from asthma to lung cancer. And that Black children are the most likely to be exposed to neurotoxins, such as mercury. So the We Charge Genocide movement, in other words, applies well beyond police brutality. And it's vital that we connect state violence in the form of a policeman's bullet to other forms of lead exposure in soil and plant paint, slow death mediated by zip codes, parallel realities manufactured through housing and environmental policy, social programming that ensure that racialized groups face premature death in one form or another. So turning our attention back now to the digital, with the understanding that the line between real and virtual is contrived. Anthropologist Chris Kelty theorizes that in the 21st century, hacking and programming must be understood as forms of free speech. And when this form of expression is monopolized by a small elite, other forms of expression and ways of representing the world fail to take shape. By hacking systems of power, then, we're questioning the ventriloquism of the few who purport to speak on behalf of the many. And we refuse to simply remain consumers of a reality created by others. Instead, we insist on becoming creators, crafting life worlds that foster the well-being, intelligence, and potential of a wider communities. So as one of many examples of this kind of work, electrical engineer Kimberly Bryant started the organization Black Girls Code, which is dedicated to training young people to create their own virtual realities. In the same way, I'm entreating those of us who care deeply about justice and who move in and out of elite spaces to not simply code switch and play the game created by others, but to set out to understand existing regimes of power and knowledge so thoroughly that we can make them do something that they were not meant to do. Thank you.
Thank you. So one of the threads that I hear through each of your opening comments is, as you put it, Neelika, a need to destabilize narratives, right? We have these existing narratives, these existing discourses that circulate virtually and in the real world, and as Ruha suggests, the line between the virtual and the real is much thinner and perhaps non-existent than we sometimes imagine it. But nevertheless, we have these narratives that are out there, these discourses, and part of the work that you all are suggesting is to interrupt, to intervene, to destabilize. And I want to just each say a little bit more about what is required. I think, Ruha, you started getting us on this path with the metaphor of hacking, but I wonder if Renina and Neelika, if you want to sort of take up a little bit and how you think about the work of destabilizing some of these discourses.
Well, one of the things that comes to mind for me in terms of thinking of destabilizing existing narratives, one of the things that I find really interesting about social media right now at this contemporary moment is that we see a parallel public sphere that is in many ways driven by everyday people, right? So I think that there's this idea about how the mainstream media, or what young people like to always say, the media, and I always try and correct them and say that there's different medias that we're consuming on a day-to-day basis, right? That there is power in the ability to have public discourse, right, with other people who share a very similar sentiment that you do. So I think that power really exists in the capacity to have these connections with people who may live across the country or on the other side of the world, but you're able to talk about and sort of unpack, right, some of these images that are shown to us on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I think right along with what you said, as you were talking, I was thinking, oh, this is the right thing to talk about. And here I'm going to just tell a story as well. The Kenyan writer Binyavanga Wainaina, last year, I believe it was like at the end of January, right before February, it was it was freezing. And I remember getting a call from Sean Jacobs saying, you need to, it was like late at night, you need to check it out, we need to edit something. Binyavanga says that he's going to come out and he's going to do it on our blog. And we thought, why not, doesn't he do this on the New Yorker? Because he's that kind of writer that his memoir was published, he's so well known as this kind of almost like a trickster figure, right? Because he wrote this kind of satirical thing about how to write about Africa, the 10 things that you can do, make sure that you put a crying baby in the front. And so people read it and they think, oh yes, that's how we should write about Africa, because they don't read irony. And when he decided to come out, part of what he actually, and accompanied by several videos as well, one of the things he said was I wanted to do this on my own terms, on something that's, in quotes, ours, right? Instead of 10 people in elite New York will read it and think, oh, homophobia happens in the heart of darkness, Africa, and that is where they're stoning gay people to death, and Binyavanga must come and live in America in order to be free. Instead of thinking of these complex ways in which evangelical Christianity in its most ugly and virulent form is funding these campaigns in key African countries, not all of them, in Uganda, in Kenya now, in Zambia, Malawi, Nigeria, and how those kinds of monetized churches are intersecting with the legal systems of the country as well. And then how do you even combat that kind of money and that kind of historical church kind of schooling that we've had for 200 whatever years? And then one of the things he wanted to do was sort of intervene and hack that with a global network of people who have access to the internet. And Kenyan audiences, Nigerian audiences, and South African audiences are widely online, although it still tends to be and the diaspora is definitely online because we're looking for stories at home, and the internet is the way in which we connect with home, right? And so when he came out through this kind of lost chapter in his memoir, which he said was the story he never got to tell his mother. It was heartbreaking. It made me weep with understanding, and you don't think about you think about your own story that you never got to speak to your father, to your mother, and to your sister. And what he did was something that touched people in a way that made us understand, made a global public understand that homophobia is not about Africa, but about a complex network of power. And in that way, through a story, he made us understand that through coming out with a story. And then, this intervention of videos, because then you went and watched it. But without having that network public that's on the internet, and I'm not just like a yay internet booster at all, because Kony 2012, so that should tell you that it can't just be like all good, right? But I know that there's certain ways in which, like, if you are aware of making use of those networks, there's ways in which you can really hack into them and not just like play the codes. So I find that to be an enormously powerful thing, that what he did.
What about commercial interests? Right. I mean, that's something that seems to sort of loom very large when we talk about the digital, and particularly when we think about social media, right? Facebook is a corporation, Twitter's a corporation, down the line, right? And there's this discourse that circulates that around social media and social activism that suggests that these things are emancipatory, right? They are tools for liberation. Whether they were intended that way or not, we can harness them, we can use them. Whether we're playing the game or hacking, I think is the question. But nevertheless, this is an idea that I think has some real traction, some currency, and yet we also understand these things to be these corporate entities that are motivated not by liberation, right? To put it mildly, right? By other things. And so how do you all think about either for yourselves or sort of more broadly in terms of the communities that you engage with, negotiating that particular tension?
I mean, one of the notions that I've been sort of thinking about is the role of refusal. Like, when is it time to opt out, to use that strategically? That on the one hand, we can think about times and places and movements when it is about kind of harnessing and intervening and strategizing within existing paradigms. And then we need to also think about kind of an informed refusal in the context of biomedicine, which in biotechnology, which is where it's sort of my, where I tend to think about this, the idea of informed consent, that people are included after they have the requisite information, and the assumption is always, as long as you understand, then you will agree, right? The trajectory is very much in terms of pushing forward a kind of inclusionary politics. And so within that context, I've been thinking more and more, again, partly as a result of all forms of commercialization, as a result to health and ancestry testing and so on, what would it mean to have an informed refusal, that after understanding, the conclusion that you reach is actually to remove yourself. And what struck me in one of the comments was how the suggestion was, if you are interested or care about these, shut off the TV and read the book. Like, at some point, we need to have a politics that's not sort of, anti-technology, but it's actually a strategic way of engaging it as well. I think we have to have conversations around about using that.
I think that your comment and your question really speaks for me to questions of ownership, right? Oftentimes people think that just because something is on social media, be it an image or text, etc., that it's available for use, right? But when I think about journalists, right, and it's their job to write articles, there are very clear guiding rules around using private conversations. And so one of the things that arises for me with regard to Twitter and accountability is, one of the things that I like to say is, just because it's public doesn't mean that it's lawless, If my body is physically in public, there are rules in which there's a way in which I would expect to be treated, right? And in terms of knowledge production being on the internet, there are expectations in terms of how I expect my knowledge to be treated. But I know ultimately I don't own Twitter. I don't own Facebook. And I know that these corporations are accountable to their shareholders, not me. So there certainly is that tension, right? That is the other side of the coin in terms of the politics of being public.
I mean, my partner actually does not post any of his photographs on the internet and doesn't even refer to himself. I am not going to ever name him on the internet because he works for a corporation. He's a trained computer engineer, so he knows exactly what Facebook does. The moment I go and look for some new running shoes, suddenly Facebook, even though it was on a different browser, is offering me that same shoe and the same color too. I don't know how and why, and he's like, oh, it's just a code, it's an algorithm. And I think, oh my God, this is why. And yet, like, our professional lives and our activism cannot function, not in this day and age, without that, without using those technologies that are not motivated by liberation at all. They're collecting all our information. And I mean, my tiny rebellion is that I never click on an ad on Facebook, even though they are actively offering me things I would like. They know. But I think I will open a different browser altogether. If I'm using Safari, I'll go to Chrome or whatever, and then look for that thing separately. But it's a dumb thing that I'm doing. But I just know that there is so much about your body that's being collected, even in an old school, like a dentist office. If the dentist takes a picture, there is a consent form that you're supposed to sign, that they can use, your image, your cells, whatever, your story, in fact, or even a therapist can use your story in order to write a book referring to you as a subject, I really disagree with that, because that's my narrative, which I've entrusted that person with in the case of a therapist, or my bodily narrative that I've entrusted with a medical person. I don't want it to be part of the lecture circuit that gains that person notoriety, fame, blah, 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 credentials. But yet I don't have the ability to say no to that as long as I'm being referred to anonymously. And so those are things that people think I'm mad when I actually say things like that, or when I'm at home in my home country, tourists go by and take photographs of me because I'm with a wedding party and we look cute and in like cute clothes that look exotic. That we become somebody else's kind of subjectivity formation because they went to Africa and took a picture of cute natives in native clothes, So I don't want that. But yet, they're taking it from far away and I can't stop them from doing that. And you become the ownership of your body is already something that you have to really struggle with. But definitely Facebook is not there to help you keep your friends and look at your niece's pictures. Not at all. So yeah, I know. I think you have to be really careful about what you put out there on Facebook.
I mean, it highlights or underscores the importance of opting out on the one hand, but also the impossibility, or at least the extreme difficulty of opting out at any kind of serious level. I mean, all of these technologies, all of these platforms, almost all of them have some user agreement. Right, when you sign up, when you update. I mean, iTunes is famous for this. iTunes comes to the new iTunes, and you there's a new agreement, and it's 61 pages or something. Nobody's going to print that. Nobody's going to read that. And even if you could and do print out and read it, you're most likely not going to understand it. And so it's the cost of doing the business and of having all your music available to you. Cost of using Twitter, cost of using Google as a search engine is this kind of monetization of your online presence. But I think it takes a particular valence when we think about activism and think about the kind of social justice work that we're trying to do.
There's even a South Park episode about that. I can't remember who it was. It wasn't Cartman, like one of the two other boys who will not read that, and they do gross things to him, but because nobody reads that.
Right.
And they claim, well, we told you in the small print.
You check the box.
Yeah, I know. And it's the first thing that comes up whenever you're stopped in a plane or airport for being a terrorist, for anybody who looks Arab, South Asian, something brownish. That's the first thing that's happened to many people, is that so and so checked on Twitter, or the arresting officers checked on Twitter, and you're held up in the airport over the things you may or may not have said on your Facebook profile.
We're going to turn in a moment to questions from our various audiences, but I want to ask pose one last sort of problematic, I guess, to the panel, and that's around this issue of public, right? And I think for me has different dimensions to it. I mean, so one aspect is simply, how do you imagine your publics, or who do you believe to be your publics, and you're doing the various kinds of work that you're doing, and engaging in the digital. But also, I mean, I didn't want to go here, but I feel like I have to, this firestorm that has sort of unfolded over the last day in social media around Black public intellectuals, and this New Republic piece by Michael Eric Dyson, a sort of takedown of Cornel West. There's a lot we could say about it, and I actually don't want to spend time talking about it, but I think it raises precisely these questions of public engagement for academics. Maybe not in the terms that we all might think of. I mean, there's many levels to which it's incredibly retrograde, but I think it speaks to at least a broader tension within Black studies, in particular around publics and public engagement, and what is the responsibility, or what are kind of the ethics of doing scholarly work on the one hand, and extra scholarly work, and particularly, and for our purposes here, extra scholarly work that is digital, or is mediated digitally, or circulates digitally. So just if you want to take up any piece of that issue of public and publics.
I do a lot of work right now that faces young folks of color who are interested in art and activism. In particular, as I mentioned before, I love films and filmmaking. So if you have been to the movies within the last week or the last month, and that is something that you want to use as a point of departure, that's certainly something that I'm engaged with in terms of those communities. For a long time, my primary work was really speaking to the intersection of both hip hop and feminism. So that is really, in some ways, how I got started, right? So I would say that the circles that I feel connected to and accountable to in many ways, right, are some of the academic spaces that address issues with regard to social justice, and folks who are interested in work around digital Black feminist work or offline Black feminist work. I try not to use that divide between off and online, in part because those worlds are connected. And I think that it can be really useful and powerful to acknowledge that.
So the response to the first question in terms of publics, my foremost public are my students. And so I consider my classrooms and my students in that form of engagement to be both the most authentic and real, in that for it to be meaningful, I feel like there needs to be a deep sense of reciprocity, and a lot of what passes for public engagement I see as forms of performance in which there is no real feedback loop, right? And for me, that's essential for what it would mean to have engagement, is that I need to be listening as much as I'm talking, and often lecturing and sort of all kinds of work outside of classrooms, there's less of that, right? In terms of the sort of moment that we're in, the last 24 hours, I don't have anything really profound to say except to express a sense of sorrow at where we are and what we're witnessing. And what it makes me think about is how we attribute power to the public sphere, and how I feel like we've kind of lost a sense of how to use the private. So I think about some work by folks who do work around Black folks and privacy, and how so much of the scholarship is focused on having access to the public, right? The public, not as people, but the public sphere, and how partly I think what gets submerged is how what we also need to be fighting for space in the private, to have a private life, to have what one scholar calls the sovereignty of the quiet, right? To be able to understand the inner lives of Black folks as something that is sacred, and that, not everything that I want and that I think we should collectively want needs to be visible to everyone. And again, that speaks to some of the issues about the pornography of genocide, right? Both in terms of the kind of images that we think that it's only meaningful if everyone can see it and account for it, and but I think that there's certain things that should be held in the private precisely because they are so powerful. And in some ways I feel this conversation that's happening between two of our beloved scholars is something that should be in the private. Like, there should be something sacred about that, and I don't feel it needs to be performed for the rest of us to consume.
That a scholarly disagreement, as well as a political disagreement, can be discussed in a different format rather than as a takedown on this kind of platform. Is that what you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes we assume that it's only real if everyone can see it, and it's only, and so I
see what you mean.
So I'm thinking, so let's connect that to this idea of images circulating of Black death. One of the scholars whose work I love and admire, Caretha Mitchell, has a book called Living with Lynching. And she talks about the way that Black communities would create lynching plays to rehumanize those that they've lost, to talk about their subjectivity in living rooms, in churches, in community spaces. And so while white folks who were having barbecues with, charred Black bodies were sending postcards to relatives all across the country, sort of displaying Black death in the way that sometimes we have it on Twitter and Instagram, the way that Black folks were trying to process Black death was with one another in a kind of sacred, private, communal space in which they were rehumanizing together. And they didn't need, in some ways, what white folks were doing by just having these images public was another form of dehumanization. And I think in some ways we need to study that way of processing together in real time, and they used performance, but it was a whole different kind of performance where it wasn't for an applause or an audience, but it was this form of reciprocity in which they witnessed the tragedy, and they witnessed one another's sorrow. And I feel like we need to learn in some ways from that form of communalism.
Yeah, it's like a funereal ceremonial kind of performance versus putting on a song and dance kind of play, right? Because I'm thinking my father just passed a few months ago, and when I went back, everybody who came from his childhood, people I'd never met because I never lived in Sri Lanka, and he hadn't either for many over 3 decades. The stories they told were amazing, and it is a very public and a very theatrical kind of performance. And I was thinking about this as a kind of community theatre, because you never leave your being scholar, even though your father has just passed, right? So you're sitting there thinking, I was sitting there thinking, oh, they're reenacting his youth. And their youth, right? Although he had a good life and a good death, so it wasn't about mourning somebody who's been violently taken away to reclaim him. It was a claiming of a joyous kind of life they shared, as well as a recognition of the fact that life is passing and they too will pass, as will I. So there's a long deep set of narratives with which we engage, even in a funeral, which is not horrendously violent, or about a person's horrendously violent passing. There's an allowance for those kinds of deep understandings of your existential person, as well as this, literal person that passed. And I don't think you can do that in that kind of public sphere. If I had been tweeting away things like that, it would have been terrible. I would have been very angry. I can't imagine if I think of like the way that I've heard a few sentences that Winnie Mandela has spoken about having to share her husband, of a few years really, in death even, with the whole world and with the whole ANC's kind of public theatrical stuff. It would be horrendous to not have a private moment with your loved one that you only had for a few moments. That's theater that's theater about power, right? Yeah, not about your personal relationship at all. I think the thing about the public is, like, of course, on the internet, your public are full of trolls too. It's not an engaged public who actually wants to discuss any of this. They're really there to, deal with mental illnesses. Then I say that full of understanding about their suffering too, as well as with ire. I do have annoyance and ire about it, but I also see that suffering body and that suffering psyche there on a public place, asking to be recognized and spewing out anger as a way to kind of say, I am important. And so that public is very much a big part of an internet public. So you have to really watch out for that. And people are there to kind of maintain their power structures. So a lot of what we get are people saying, you're full of shit, why do you always have to point this out? You keep on saying the same things, and we think, we wouldn't have to keep on saying that if your husband wasn't doing that all the time. So, you're wondering, like, for every 10 times that CNN puts a bad map, maybe we publish once a year the bad map. And sometimes we just do it on Twitter because it's boring to keep pointing it out. But yet you're going to be called out for having done that. Like, you're always negative. So your public is, there to sort of catch you at falling, not to catch you as you're falling. And to point it out and to kind of ridicule you and vilify you, because they're engaged in maintaining those power structures which aided them, and they're invested in maintaining them, not in kind of destabilizing it all.
Let's take some questions or comments from here in the room or here on my iPad. Anyone question or a comment for the panel? Yes. Down. Let's get the mic.
Thank you. Firstly, thank you guys for speaking. This has been really incredible. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more, especially you. I don't know. Can I call you by your first name?
Renina.
Renina. If you could talk a little bit more just about like what you do dealing with the images of Black Death that appear on like Facebook and stuff. Like recently, I've been struggling a lot with just every day. There's so many stories being posted all the time, and for a while I was sharing and I was like trying to make sure that everybody got wind of all of it, but then it became so much that I'm just having trouble like with that tension of like trying to get out the knowledge of like all these things that are happening, but at the same time just how heavy it is and how, like you were saying, it's so the focus is on the death, not on the life. And so I just wanted to know if you have any like strategies that you use to deal with that.
I like to immerse myself in worlds of art. I think that be it visual art, film, literature, the visual mainly, right? So there's this way that I'm really deliberate about how much time I spend on social media. And if I do spend time in those spaces, I would just remove myself if I see that I'm being triggered, right? The other side in terms of sharing is always thinking that the other person who is my friend or follower or whatever on social media, they're a human being as well. And so I never know what's going on in someone else's interior life. So I like to check in and think about whether or not I want to retweet something or whether or not I want to share that image, because there's a sort of ethics behind that, not just in terms of taking care of myself, but taking care of other people as well, just in terms of this idea of accountability. So I would I would look at it as though, in terms of thinking strategically and deliberately, thinking about it in terms of being on a diet of sorts, and just saying that, like, in terms of what's happening on social media right now with Rekia Boyd, I am not going on there. I don't want to see it. And for me, it's just really important to understand that seeing those things over and over again are powerful for a reason.
I mean, one of the things that your question makes me think about is what we want that information and those images to do, like the assumption of the trajectory of what it is we're sending out and what we expect it to do on the other end. And I think sometimes we are assuming that information is having a particular impact that it's not having, and that's actually can have the opposite. I'll just give you a quick example. There was a recent study about white attitudes towards the disparity in incarceration rates, and they approached passengers that were coming off of the train in San Francisco, and they surveyed people in New York, presented them with information about the disparities in incarceration rates, their cities compared to the national rates, and so on, so that the person that they were interviewing had a sound grasp of the disparity, right? Some akin to what we would want an image to do. Look, it's bad. It's happening to a select group, and this is the reality. And what they found was that those individuals who were presented the information of the disparity were less likely to support reforms in the criminal justice system than those who had no information about it. And so the information somehow was fueling a sense that those people are getting what they deserve. And they were less likely to support specific bills that were on the ballot to change that reality. So I think sometimes we need to, again, if we think about race as a way that's making us perceive the same information radically different. We're both looking at the same image. We're both looking at the same statistic and interpreting it through vastly different sort of epistemological and so on lenses, right? That you can come to a different, completely different conclusion. And I think we need to account for the fact that our country has created those parallel universes in the way that many, many white Americans perceive these disparities, perceive these images, right?
This line of our discussion, I think, raises another set of questions, some of which have been posted to us online, and that's about the role of social media in organizing work, which we've touched on a little bit, but I wonder if we could talk about a little bit more explicitly. So on the one hand, we have what we might think of as citizen journalists, or just people acting in good conscience who are documenting things and circulating. And we know much more about police violence and extra-state violence now, at least in certain dimensions of it, than we did, in previous periods. The pervasiveness of it, but also the particular texture of it. So there's that. But there's also the way that social media is being used by organizers to organize and to mobilize. There's a lot of pontificating, there's a lot of analysis as well, drawing the parallels between the U.S. Southern Black freedom struggle of the 1950s and 60s and our current moment, and thinking about the difference that technology makes, right? I mean, I think about a Malcolm Gladwell piece in the New Yorker from several years ago about, what if the Greensboro Four had Twitter, and this kind of idiom has been taken up by a number of different people. Mark Anthony Neal has a discussion about this. So the question, I guess, is, what do you see, what do you observe in the use of social media by social justice organizers, whether here in the U.S. or abroad? What's really effective, what's new, and what is just maybe new packaging over really old ideas about what works as organizing technique?
The ability, I think that one of the things that's really significant about how social media is having an impact is the sheer speed and velocity in terms of being able to get a lot of people in one place at a particular time. I think that organizing takes bodies, right? And it takes time and it takes knowledge production. So the way that these technologies have sort of facilitated the opportunity to get people in the room, or get people in the street rather, because ultimately that's what we've been seeing lately, has been incredibly key, right? I think that in some ways, the social media spaces can be dangerous in that they obscure sort of these offline networks and institutions that have always been there. And it's always really important when I'm talking about social justice organizing movement, social justice organizing movement work, is sort of those recent and also contemporary histories, that we don't lose sight of the work that has been done in the past, in particular with historical Black institutions in the US.
I was thinking about, for instance, in Egypt, there was so much speculation, and it was just not even a proposed idea or a theory that it was Twitter and Facebook that made the revolution happen. And there were activists working for years in Nigeria too, within the last couple of years, that when people went and protested against the removal of a fuel subsidy, Nigerians had been organizing and under great fear and threat, as were people in Egypt as well. So it's not that the hashtag and Twitter made the Egyptian revolution happen magically
overnight.
Yeah, because the internet made the revolution happen. It's not. It's people who organize, and it's a tool. The camera didn't make the revolution happen. It's a technology that people use, like we use any technology, right? Like a car. Nobody was saying the car made the revolution happen because the car drove me over to the square, right? So it's kind of hilarious that those things are valorized, because people are invested in saying the internet has been this great force. Then it takes me back to what you said, this warning about who's using this tool, right? And knowing that it's not why are we so invested in saying it's the internet that made Tahrir Square happen? It did mobilize people, but people were mobilized because they had relationships with each other and were politically committed to that goal, right? And they had to be there in body. And then on the converse end, it's terrifying to think that the woman who would not make the wedding cake or serve the pizza to the gay couple, or the policeman who shot a man dead, will get millions of donations overnight, within a week. And that's also social mobilizing right there. And that anonymity is what serves that kind of donation, because nobody will want to, few will want to be named.
So as an academic, for me, when I think about that question, it becomes important for me to listen to the people who are on the ground using Twitter to mobilize, as opposed to assessing its utility from without. And so for me, I am struck by how efficacious those who are using it find it. And one of the things that I hear is that it's about getting bodies, and it's about disseminating information, but its utility also comes from its ability to stage conversations and feedback, that idea of reciprocity. And as I was sort of thinking about our conversation today, I just pulled one of the statements from one of the key people who I sort of follow, DeRay McKesson, about his understanding about Twitter, how it's useful to him. So I'll just read very briefly that he says, Twitter specifically has been interesting because we're able to get feedback and responses in real time. If we think about this as community building, and we think of community building as a manifestation of love, and we think about love being about accountability, and accountability about justice, what's interesting is that Twitter has kept us honest. There's a democracy of feedback. I've had really robust conversations with people who aren't physically in the space, but who have such great ideas, and that's proven to be invaluable. So I think when we begin to evaluate utility, it's really important in terms of not bringing just an abstract assessment, but also thinking about those who are using it to do the work and how they're finding its
there's a question or a couple of questions about access, and this has also come up. And access in sort of different ways. I mean, so there's a couple questions about internet access, right? Because there was a conversation 15 or more years ago around the digital divide. And that conversation has largely been eclipsed, although perhaps not everywhere, but I think it's something that we ought to think about. Not everyone has a smartphone. Certainly not everyone has home, high-speed internet access. Most people, many people, thousands, millions of people rely on public libraries and other institutions, churches and so forth, for internet access in the U.S. And then we think outside the U.S., the mobile device has different kinds of mobile technology and connectivity and proliferation. I mean, the patterns, in other words, are different than they are here, particularly on the continent. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about access and how that informs any of what we've been talking about.
Well, ultimately, when I think of questions of access, it takes me directly to questions of social class, right? And this idea, it's a really interesting paradox, because we were just talking about how it's really easy sometimes to look at social media or sort of these technologies as sort of making magic happen. But the bottom line is this hardware costs money. Cell phones are not free. Internet access isn't free. So I think that in terms of thinking about the possibility and limitations of both the hardware and the software, social class and just the ability to pay for these items certainly is one of the first things that comes to mind. There's a hand.
So,
hi.
Hello.
Okay. Hi, my name is Dan Kurtz. I'm a teacher, and I live in the area, so it's always great to come down here. I'm glad that you brought that up, Professor. Because this is something actually that I feel quite passionate about, and this is what I feel that a lot of people are not informed about in the year 2015. The infrastructure of urban providing wireless internet access to dense populations is, and I'm coining a phrase here, dumb cheap. It's so cheap compared to 5 years ago, that if I told you in relative terms, you would be shocked. Shocked. Now, it is true that 5-10 years ago, the idea of saying, we should take Trenton, which is a relatively small community, African-American, Latino majority, absolutely, definitely has been for about 30 years, poor, and we should make it into a universal Wi-Fi zone. Okay, you should make it into a universal Wi-Fi zone, cloud internet, so anybody can log on, no problems, no questions asked, no problems. 5 or 10 years ago, that would be like a $20 million project. People might say to you, well, geez, that's really nice that you feel that way, but hey, man, why don't we just build a swimming pool in everybody's backyard, right? Not the case anymore. Not the case. The cost of a router to deliver internet access to 300-400 people, $10, maybe 20, maybe 20 if you bought it wholesale, maybe 20. So the price to take that, put 4 or 5 of them up in a major street section, 10 of them, 20 of them with the internet access. Now we're talking maybe, I don't know, $100, $150. Not $100,000, not $200,000, which Philadelphia learned 5 years ago. But everything now is changed. Everything is different, okay? And the learning curve of people in the elite and people in the authority is frightening, because we could do it now. This is no longer the equivalent of bringing fresh tap water to everybody in New York City. That was a moonshot. That took 20, 30 years. That was a moonshot, okay?
Can we let our panelists respond, or do you want to ask a question, or just want them to sort of reflect on the question of urban internet access?
Right, so my question is, don't you think that that's something worth investing in or learning more about? Thank you.
Yes.
Well, thank you for voicing that, because I'm aware of it, because at home I have a computer engineer who's always saying This is so much bullshit that we have to pay X for. This is really a free thing in the area we live in, you know, not in some remote mountainous region in northern Italy where there's a dedicated entrepreneur who's made billions and wants to provide his like home village with free internet or something like that. But why aren't we doing it? And you know, throughout like Southern Africa, East Africa, people are using their mobile devices, but very few people. I mean, you know, everybody from a man who's selling vegetables, who comes with fish on his in a basket on his bike, will have you know, texting. Will text my mom and saying, "Madam, I have X," you know, but not smartphone, because they're far more expensive, right? So it takes a middle class to be able to afford internet in Southern and East Africa, and for sure throughout Africa. And in certain countries there are that, but usually it's at the internet cafe. For us, the public library version is the internet cafe, and illegal stuff happens there too, you know, like, as you know, like Yahoo Boy stuff. You know what I'm talking about? Oh, never mind.
As you know.
No, but the guys who send you weird emails saying, you know, I need to take my $1 billion out, I'm a prince, can you please help me by, you know, that stuff is happening at the internet cafe too. But you know, like, you take your grandparents there so that they can talk to you know, grandchild across an ocean away. So, you know, like, people take their family members there so that they can talk to the diaspora. So those are the places where throughout, you know, in the continent, that's where people are accessing the internet. But here, I always think like, and it's very expensive there. So really only the upper middle class and those going to university, for instance, can access the internet on a regular basis. It means that the kind of engagement that the wealthy have, and especially in South Africa, white South Africans, this party called the Democratic Alliance, for instance, became hugely popular through the use of Twitter and internet, because they knew who their public was, you know. So it creates a even worse divide, in fact, in many ways. I'm always kind of stupefied by the fact that there isn't free internet access in urban areas in the US, because it is so easy to actually provide.
I mean, one of the things that your comment raises is that these technologies, the question of how they are distributed, where they are never ever simply a matter of their availability and their existence, that they operate within a socio-technical system in which there are decisions made about who the future users are, who, in terms of their values and interests. And so if we juxtapose the lack of the, you know, this existence of, you know, the wireless routers versus the existence of cameras, right, and surveillance systems, right? So it's not simply a matter that we don't have the resources to do it, or that we think that the infrastructure is not there. It's about what this population means in a larger ecosystem. And so here, in this case, we want to watch them, but we don't necessarily think there's a need for them to have autonomy to communicate, you know, for free in this way, and what political threat that may pose.
Sorry, I just want to clarify one thing too.
Very quickly.
Oh, okay. Is that it's also interesting too when you talk about middle class lifestyle logistics. Before the internet, where would working class people meet? They just closed the last Starbucks, even though this is a cliche. The last Starbucks in Newark closed about 5 or 6 years ago, and it was a very practical conversation. It's just like, well, where can, you know, the leadership of minority communities, doctors, where can they meet? They have no third place. There's no third place. So it's just very interesting and tragic, I think, that, like you said, Professor, that the bandwidth that it takes to record individuals every moment of every day, that compared to all the people being recorded using email is like, it's not even comparable.
Right,
you know?
right.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, thank you. And so again raises the question of the public and the commons and the digital commons, and as well, you know, what constitutes a utility and a right to a utility versus a luxury, right? I mean, I think we have a mode of thinking and really an ideology that's held over from some time ago that sees internet access as a luxury, right? But I think we've gone through such a shift in the culture in which it's not really a luxury anymore. It's so sort of essential to people's lives, just for accessing public services, accessing the welfare system, health system, to sign up for the Affordable Care Act, you need, so on and so forth. Other questions or comments from here? Yes, in the back.
So my question's about access as well, but kind of further than just literal access. So I think as you all were discussing it, the internet is considered revolutionary, but nothing's really revolutionary if it's not accessible to the poor. Mm-hmm. And my question is, in terms of just like the language and conversation, like with the TNR article that came out, I think it's kind of like gonna dominate, I guess, like Black intellectual discussion, or discussion of people of color, but how much are those conversations accessible to the Black poor and people of color who are poor, and then how much is that even useful to the issues that are specific to them, or like Black masses, or however you want to consider it? Because it's kind of, I think a lot of times with like being on Twitter and Tumblr, there's these extremely intellectual conversations that are important, but they seem very like specific, like representation always comes up like in media, but how important is that in reality when like Black female representation has been a big thing with TV, but then how important is that when you think about like young Black girls in like the inner city and like how they're like policed in schools? It's like how there's a connect, but also I think there's a disconnect in terms of like access to the conversation and who's involved in conversations and who should be, and just how do you navigate that, I think.
I think I saw another hand there, did I?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was the same question, or you want to?
It's different.
Okay, good. Why don't you add on your question, and then we'll have time for the panelists to offer some final.
My question is about how, like, the political currency of social media. So I think we often use social media as a tool for awareness and also as a tool for organizing bodies. But how do we then move social media so it's not just a mechanism that makes people aware of issues, but it kind of moves institutions and moves structural changes, right? Because awareness is one good aspect of social media, but if we want to see real changes, how does social media play into the changes that we may be able to see?
Great. So access, and particularly kind of classed and gendered dimensions of that, the access, access to the public sphere, the digital public sphere, and then the currency, right? And sort of the value placed on this kind of communication.
I guess, sort of thinking across those two questions, I think we need to continue to question our starting assumptions about what's happening when we sort of, are using and sort of disseminating information. I think one of the points about, raising awareness is that very easily that tips over into desensitization, it's sort of like the proliferation of information. And so I think that, one of the things that I was hoping to sort of get at with my opening comments was for us to think about other kinds of technologies that aren't simply based on hardware and software. Is that thinking of technology in the broadest sense, right, of techniques to make things happen in the world. I think we also need to think about how do we personally come to become committed to a cause or committed to justice? Was it a news story? Was it a statistic? Or was it some aspect of a meaningful human connection, right, or community in which sort of our sympathies and empathies and concerns grew over time, right? I think sometimes we forget how we have sort of become committed to things and expect other people to be transformed by just the right story or just the right study that's going to change their mind. And so I think we need to think about process and not rely on the hardware and software to do the heavy lifting, right? I think we need to turn back on ourselves and think about what we're losing in the process of sort of unintentionally falling into kind of techno-determinism when it comes to social change.
I like your first question as well as your comment with regard to thinking about the limitations of representation on social media spaces, thinking about who exactly is the intended audience for this scholarly conversation that we see happening between Dyson and West at this moment, right? And what does this conversation mean broadly to some of our most vulnerable people, right? young girls and boys of color in working class and low income neighborhoods that are surveilled by the state. In fact, when you were speaking, the first thing that came to mind was the Black Girls Matter report, and the way in which I see it as being a conversation with the policy that came out of the White House.
My Brother's Keeper.
My Brother's Keeper, and how they're in conversation with one another. And I really see them using sort of these statistics and these stories, right, to drive public conversation in terms of making structural changes. So I think that it's really important to not be overly techno-determinist, right? But it's also important for me when I often will look at something and say, you know what, this person wrote this isn't for me. I'm not the intended audience, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that there is utility to conversations that we see happening right now in terms of this Black public sort of, in some ways it feels like a breakup. But I also know that the structural changes are absolutely important.
I think often that happens if something that intervention hasn't happened in your life, the state has impacted your life and you're wounded from it, right? And you find ways to cover it up through infotainment offered by this same thing. Mm-hmm. So most of my students are really busy looking through TMZ. And I have no problem watching some TMZ. It's totally entertaining. You can do great scholarship on TMZ, about TMZ really, and not while on it, but sort of, but it's also like, I think that's what people do, like you go and take a hit off of something that gives you escapism, because it's too hard to think about the ways in which, like for me, immigration was probably the greatest wound that my family experienced. And then I had no idea about the effect of it, or that I was bleeding, or that my family bled from it, or the community around us bled from our being there, or all those kinds of very complicated issues about being an other in this country, and how my papers made my body illegal here. And I had no idea until I had a friend who explained to me what it was like growing up in the south side of Chicago. And I was thinking, wait a minute, I kind of get it. It's different. It's a different story, but I kind of get it. And she was the one who introduced me to Black scholarship to explain that kind of wounded subjectivity. And I was like, this is it. I'm going to check out of microbiology now and like start reading W.B. Du Bois. And so suddenly, like it was a personal relationship and a long-term friendship, and scholars, my professors who invested in me and my confusion with a hope for me in a way that I didn't have hope for me. And I don't think that I would have gone on Twitter, had Twitter been around at that time, to figure it out. I would have gone on Twitter to like entertain myself. I'd be on Kim Kardashian's website. I swear it. I know it. I'd be as shallow as her. And then, like that's what most of my students are doing. They're not, they're entertaining themselves out of pain. So they're not engaging with that deeper, the conversation that I hope they will have. But, it does happen sometimes in a classroom. So in a way, that elitism comes back, because how many people get to be in a classroom? Who's in that, situation where you're not reading about how women have been enormously kind of violated, and all they're doing is kind of checking into that methodology of violation further, right?
Alas, our time has come to a close. As I said at the outset, I hope this conversation will continue both online and off. I hope that we will, both in our own classrooms and friend networks and other ways, continue to promote a kind of critical media practice and critical media consumption that I think is so vital and so necessary, that we, even as we're sort of mobilized by the hashtag, that we also think about the erasures that are behind those hashtags, think about, hashtag Walter Scott or hashtag, Eric Garner, that we think about the Black women and the Black trans people who don't get hashtags, who don't get mobilized, and we continue to both in our social media spaces, but also again in offline spaces, do the kind of real work of educating and organizing, educating ourselves, mobilizing our friends around some of these issues. So thank you all for your attendance, and let's give our panelists a great round.